and thank you for attending. My name is Erickson Lorette. I am a student of anthropology at New Hampshire's Plymouth State University, and today I'd like to present to you a discussion on the more archaeological and cultural anthropological side of cryptozoology. Namely, today's presentation will be discussing the Yeti in archaeology, an examination and physical comparison of both cultural and anecdotal apemen. And what I mean by that is today is a bit of an excursion into the Yeti as it appears in the framework of Tibetan mythological culture, roughly speaking, as well as how the Yeti tends to appear in the more physically archaeological side of the spectrum. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Yeti. But instead of becoming more familiar with the Yeti first, it seems important to become familiar with mythology, because to discuss the Yeti's presence in mythology, we must first understand what exactly mythology is. And mythology is not exactly, it's not very easily defined, because mythology is very all-encompassing. In fact, by definition, it is an all-encompassing thing. Here, this definition I lay out says, mythology is a collection of rough, often fantastical, self-canonical stories within a particular culture's religious narrative that lays the framework for the ways in which that particular culture views its existence and place within the larger levels of existence. And that might be a bit, it's an intricate definition, but what it basically states is that, well, a mythology is a bit like, it's an anthology. A mythology is an anthology of stories, and that's implied by the self-canonical aspect of these stories. And they're often fantasy-driven, so there's very physically unrealistic aspects to these stories, and components to it, perhaps is a better term. And you can see that in these two pieces of art that I have here. One is from an ancient Greek urn, actually. And the urn is communicating this sort of battle scene between regular mortals and these centaur beings, which are obviously an element of fantasy. There's also a minor, almost fairy-like god or goddess on the bottom level of his face as well. And you have this Sumerian depiction, which I believe it to be Gilgamesh, who was a popular figure in Sumerian mythology. And he's got these sort of double-bladed swords or tridents or knives with him. And he is battling this griffin or sphinx-like animal. And even Gilgamesh himself is displaying these four wings about him. So there is a very fantastical element to these stories. Now, of course, that begs the question, well, how could a fantastical story lay the groundwork for how a culture views its existence necessarily? And that's a very good question. One thing that you'll hear quite often when discussing mythology is that mythologies are meant to explain the inexplicable. In this lecture, I would like to posit to you that may be partially the case, but that it doesn't seem to functionally be the case, nor does it seem to be the thing that takes front and center stage as the case for mythologies. So, a mythology is a story, or it's a collection of stories, so a myth is a story, is more accurate. So, if a myth is a story, what separates it from something like a bedtime story? Well, that's tough, because a mythology and a bedtime story both express something, but a mythology is more defined than what is being expressed in the bedtime story is, so maybe that's our discrepancy there. The myth tends to express a fundamental truth of some sort, whereas a bedtime story may also express that, but maybe is to be taken more lightly than the myth is, or something along those lines. And I would even argue that in some cases there really is no difference aside from perhaps cultural and historical context. So if that's the case, we have to wonder why a story might be expressive of that. And well, it seems to be the case that fundamental truths are hard to verbally or even physically convey and articulate. So perhaps some kind of representation of the truth is needed, an avatar of the truth, let's call it. And of course, then you have to, if we're to assume that's the case, we'll need some evidence to assume that first. And well, you becomes the right lecture if that's what you're looking for. So there are three things that are present in mythologies, and those are, they're roughly categorized as repeating ideas, but they're mostly metaphors and archetypes. Excuse me. So you've got this thing called an archetype, and an archetype is a strange thing. An archetype, roughly speaking, it's not an embodiment, because an archetype is embodied. I suppose you might even argue, which some have, that it is a type of embodiment that can be categorized based on what's being embodied. And these archetypes are what is repeating ideas. They're recurrent traits, usually found in characters, for that matter, both human and non-human, that are repeated throughout not just the stories present within that particular culture's mythology, but throughout all mythologies found in the world. In a more contemporary example of one of the most classic archetypes, which is sort of the wise old man teaching the young student, is Star Wars, with Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke Skywalker in Episode 4. You've got this sort of elder who's more knowledgeable than the young man is, and he's passing on his knowledge to the young man, but he's doing so in a very in a way that invigorates the young man to step forth and fill the role once the elder is gone, and he's doing so also in somewhat magical components, and that's something you can find in just about every mythology at some point. So in that sense, you might say that an archetype is something kind of like a metaphor, but a metaphor, I would argue, is a bit different. You might even argue it's a bit more basic than an archetype, because a metaphor, for instance, tends to be more visually conveyed. So in the Adam and Eve story, Satan as the snake, the snake is metaphorically throughout most cultures a very deceitful entity, let's say. So you've got a metaphor down right then and there that isn't exactly an archetype. It's more of it's not an embodiment, that's for sure. It's more like a conveying than an actual embodiment. So the significance of these might be that, well, if all these cultures have these repeating ideas and they all tend to be quite similar, it seems that there really is being laid a framework within these cultures, not just for their existence and their place in the universe as they perceive it, but we're seeing that most cultures tend to perceive those things in quite similar manners. Of course, in quite different manners as well, but in fundamentally similar manners. And you might even argue that might suggest, I should rather say, that these are accurate representations of reality. And perhaps not accurate in a physically literal sense, but certainly accurate, and we'll find that out as we go on. And here's some more examples of repeating ideas. So you have these two things that are expressed in very early human mythology. I'm not even sure which religion this would pertain to, but you have what are called the women of Katahayuk. It's one of the oldest settlements that we know of in history. It's pretty close up there with Jericho. And what's interesting is the artifacts that we find there, we're finding these in other cultures as well, very early cultures. You find these images of matriarchs, or at least of very prominent female figures, and they're quite large. And it seems that they bear resemblances to fertility statues. So this could be a sort of fertility sign here. You have very large breasts and very large stomach. But they're sitting on thrones made of animals. And that's very interesting, because that's immediately in association with the female and nature. And you also have that in Greek mythology with Gaia. Gaia is essentially, literally, really, Mother Earth in Greek mythology. And she's definitely a feminine figure. So again, there's this link between the female and the nature around her in a good deal of mythologies. You've also got things like the Leviathan in Jormungandr. Leviathan being from more contemporary Christian belief, and Jormungandr being from Old Norse belief. But both of these are these giant serpents that lurk beneath something. Jormungandr lurks beneath a tree's roots, and the Leviathan lurks beneath the ocean, so it's somewhere you can't see quite well. And it's the idea of the serpent that hides just below something calm, like water or a forest floor. So we're going to start our excursion now into Tibetan mythology to try to understand where the Yeti fits in. And it should be understood first off that when I refer to Tibetan mythology, I don't mean solely Tibet, although I do mean mainly Tibet, because as we'll see, there's actually quite a cultural spread of these particular mythologies throughout the surrounding nations like Nepal and Bhutan, even into China and Mongolia. And you'll see that because there is this particular sequence of set repeating ideas in the Tibetan mythology that is often mirrored by the surrounding nations' mythology. And it really does come in this order, roughly speaking. The main components being the idea of compassion versus savagery, the coexistence with evil, the overcoming of chaos, and the balance of dark and light in both the universe and in oneself. And these are ideas reflected, for instance, in Mon, Bon, and Buddhism religions, the religions, Mon, Bon, and Buddhism. And what's interesting is that, again, like many other cultures, they bear resemblances to other cultures. Like the story we're about to go over relates very much to Greek mythology and Sumerian mythology in terms of its creation myth within the religion. Now, before we talk about that, we have to discuss, well, what's a creation myth? Because creation myths are actually quite unique and specific, and they're unique from other elements of the mythology, but they don't tend to be very unique from each other, actually. In fact, some of the most consistent similarities can be found in the creation myths of different cultures. Without giving too much away while we delve into the actual creation myth in Tibetan mythology, but I will go over the fundamental components that you're about to see in this story. One is that it tends to treat the world as something that's emergent. It comes out of the burnt down forest, you could call it, of something else, the corpse of something else. It emerges from something that is not as preferable, or perhaps even less comprehensible, is how the Greeks portrayed it, specifically. And that world continues to be built upon over time. It represents the world as a continuing work, you could call it. And, of course, if you have something that's built upon the death of something else, roughly speaking, that thing would have needed to have been in order at some point instead of the world. And you have that, and the Greeks called that chaos, actually. And, chaos in our culture tends to mean the opposite of the opposite of order, or the same definition as disorder, you could even say. So you got the idea that chaos is eventually conquered in the creation myth, and the remnants of chaos are used to make the order that becomes the world. And so in that sense, you've got the idea of like, well, we're going to slice chaos down to size, and we're going to make something better out of those remnants. And in that sense, sometimes there's even the idea of replacement of faulty leadership. Maybe the person who's in charge before the creation of the world is the embodiment of chaos themselves. They're the archetypal being of chaos. And then they're defeated, so it's a classic good versus evil sort of thing there. And so here we have the Tibetan creation myth in one picture, roughly speaking. And this is a quite interesting picture. So you've got this mountain range high up in the clouds. It's very high up in the clouds. And you see a few things, and one of the things you'll see is that there's very few types of animals. There's monkeys and there's deer. That's about it. But you've got this sort of centerpiece in the middle here, and there's this monkey talking to this humanoid figure who is handing the monkey a flower. So the monkey is referred to, and I apologize if I get the spelling, or sorry, the pronunciation wrong here, Fa Drengen Chengcho Simpa, which roughly translates to the grandfather monkey who wishes to enlighten, or with the intention of enlightenment. And then you have Drexel, who is a demon or mountain ogress. It kind of depends on which one you tend to look at. The general term seems to apply to demons and ogresses, specifically, again, female figures, and with the monkey being a male figure. And again, you'll notice it's the only other human-like animal in the entire image, except for this guy in the corner, and we'll get to him in a moment. So immediately you've got the idea of compassion versus savagery. The monkey wishes to enlighten the beings around it, and probably reach enlightenment itself that might also be a case there. Whereas the ogress is, well, she's an ogress, and she's a demon, so she's not a very, she's pretty nasty in her nature. But she's giving the grandfather monkey a flower. And that's quite an interesting thing, because that tends to be a romantic gesture. It's almost like the ogress is proposing to the monkey. And as it turns out, that's actually exactly what's happening. And this is actually the moment in which the ogress proposes the idea of a marriage between her and the monkey. which is kind of unprecedented. You know, why would the most chaotic being in this entire image wish to copulate or to enter a romantic arrangement with the thing that wants to bring about the good order that it knows can happen? And what's more even fascinating about that concept is it's not just unlikely, it's divine in this image, because you have this godlike figure, this sort of Buddhist or Hindu god, that's up in the smoke and the clouds. So it's watching from above, even above all the high mountains that they live in. So it's placed above that. It's higher up than that. It's on a higher level. And, you know, higher level of what? That, you know, there's probably at least 20 answers for that. But the god is looking down and is not stopping the arrangement. So this is something divine. There is something fundamentally desirable, one could say, about this particular arrangement. And, you know, this makes it quite strange, because here's a more contemporary version of the ogress, actually, and she's this very, you know, ape-like creature that is, you know, again, very nasty. She's tearing apart these animals and she's eating them, and she's smiling while doing it, so she clearly takes pleasure in pain. And that doesn't seem to be the thing that the monkey would want at all. So why would the monkey want that? Well, maybe it's something to do with the idea of the coexistence with evil. Maybe the monkey, in this case, well, the monkey does, because the monkey accepts the marriage in the mythology. The monkey, despite the fact that he wants to bring about order, is willing to enter this marriage with the ogress, because there is something that will fundamentally come about from it that could be very good. And as it turns out, something does. We have a very interesting and very common depiction here of the ogress. And it's not quite the same as we've seen before. In this version, she's the actual nation of Tibet. She is the landmass. And if you look closely at all of her central points, so you've got these monasteries and temples. So you have it on the hands, you have it on her breasts, you have it on her womb, actually, you have it on her ankles and her knees as well. So it's like she's been crucified to the ground almost. She's being pinned down. In some versions of this, there's even a phallic-shaped temple where her genitalia will be. This bears extremely strong resemblances to particularly Roman and Greek mythology, although almost equally strong resemblances can be seen in Norse mythology, can be seen in Sumerian mythology, can be seen in a variety of other mythologies. So here we have a very famous painting of the Roman Titan, Saturn, and in this rather gory image, he's devouring one of his children. What's funny is the children end up actually surviving this ordeal, and they end up overthrowing him, and they actually cut him into pieces. And what's interesting is he himself had cut his own father, Aramis, into pieces, and used him to create his kingdom. And so you've got this idea of, again, the dead order being built up upon, and the thing that's dead sort of becoming the foundation of the earth. Maybe it's something like that. And, you know, Cronus, the Greek name, Saturn here is not just a Titan, he's also a tyrant. He's not a very good ruler. I mean, a good ruler doesn't need his children, obviously. A good ruler trusts his people, let's say. And so it's no wonder he's overthrown in this story. And it's no wonder that he becomes the groundwork for the next kingdom. And even Gaia, who is Saturn's mother in the mythology, actually puts him up to the idea of slicing up Uranus, and puts his son, Jupiter, up to the idea of slicing up Saturn. And she, you know, what is she? Well, she's a feminine form that embodies the earth. She embodies the world. She embodies the things. She embodies the physical area in which these kingdoms are being built upon. And she's encouraging the building upon of these kingdoms, and also encouraging the tearing down of dysfunctional kingdoms. So she's a judgmental force. But the question is, why hold down the judgmental force? Why would you pin down the judgmental force? And, you know, there's not exactly a fair answer to that, because it's not a fair question. In fact, I would say it's a very, what would the terminology be? The people who get this wrong tend to be people who do not look beyond very small scopes of sociology and very small scopes of gender studies as well. So here we have the comparison of Gaia and the women of Katahayok. So Gaia and Katahayok women are both these sort of tied directly to nature feminine figures. And again, that's seen throughout many, many cultures. The feminine is related to nature in mythology. So, but why is that the case if the feminine is also something judgmental? Well, here's a contemporary example in Disney's Beauty and the Beast. Belle, who is of course the feminine figure, wishes to, roughly speaking, to remind Beast of his humanity. And in that term you could say, maybe civilize him is the correct terminology there. So he's a beast, but he can be civilized. And so she looks at the monster he's become and applies the judgmental force on that and says this is a disorderly rule, let's say, and says we're going to tear that down and we're going to, on the foundation of what was bad before, build upon this great new thing. And less in this film, but definitely in films like Snow White that Disney's portrayed as well, the feminine is, again, tied to nature very directly. So it's a judgmental force that is tied with nature. And the interesting thing is that the call to action for these masculine figures in these myths to change often involves having to contend with nature in some way. Physical fighting is often what comes out of that. So interacting in a vicious manner with aspects of the world around them that need to be interacted with in such a manner so that good can come about out of it. And you even see this in reality. You see this in chimpanzee troops playing out, which is quite interesting. When two males butt heads in a chimpanzee troop, unless it's over a mate, a female, and it's usually female, which is quite interesting, will actually come into the argument and, roughly speaking, broker peace. They will say, this is the beginning of a disorderly conduct, and we're not going to let that happen. We need to be able to interact with nature in proper ways, maybe not just calm ways, and maybe not just aggressive ways, but in ways that are more productive than this. So, roughly speaking, what might that mean for the feminine and the masculine in mythology? Well, the feminine is something like the judgmental force that integrates the unrelenting nature into civilized society. And it does so in a way that allows that nature to be relenting, but not harmless, because it needs to be able to break out the big guns when it can. So, in that sense, the feminine conquers nature by changing the ways in which that nature is interacted with. Whereas the masculine is the force that wins over the judgmental force's favor by answering that call to action, and not just becoming properly civilized, but also being able to contend with the aspects of nature that are persistently unrelenting. And those are the forces that the feminine is attempting to change the reaction to. So you've got these two figures that are both equally dealing with nature. You have the masculine, which is dealing with nature in terms of actually physically contending with it, whereas the feminine contends with it on a more metaphysical level. And again, there are examples of this more contemporarily in many cultures. You have it in American culture, you have it in French culture. Here you have she's a Greek goddess, and we call her Lady Justice now. You've seen the statue, I'm sure. Again, the feminine is the judgmental figure. And then you've got the Lady Liberty of the French Revolution, who is the call to action for the masculine figures in the background to change the way in which they are reacting to the nature of the world around them. And that's really interesting. Another thing that's interesting about the image is that she's holding the gun not to shoot, but to show that she has the gun. So she's showing them how to react, and they're actually holding the firearms correctly, getting ready to act. And even in more recent, very recent contemporary examples, such as the TV show Primal, there's a scene in Primal in which the main character, who's a Neanderthal basically, loses his family, and he meets a dinosaur who also loses her family. She's a dinosaur mother. And the dinosaur actually, non-verbally because it's a dinosaur, pleads with the very distraught Neanderthal to be more optimistic and join her in her journey through life, roughly speaking. So So there you have the feminine, who again recognizes that there's a change in reaction needed, and if it doesn't happen, good can't come about. And so the masculine ideally answers that call and aids the feminine in bringing about that world. And so there, right there, all of that is the overcoming of chaos in this Tibetan myth. It's interesting and very important to note, though, that the overcoming of chaos is not the slaying of chaos. The ogress in this myth is not dead. She's below us, she's the ground, but she's not dead. She's being held down. So there's the idea there of the underlying constant threat of chaos. And you see that in Norse and Egyptian myths. In the Norse myth, like I said earlier, you have Jormungandr, who is constantly below the surface of the tree and is alive. And if he breaks out, well, that's bad news, and he can break out at any time, sort of thing. And then there's the Egyptian mythologies, which are literally take the view that night is the prevailing of the underworld over their king god Ra, and daytime is Ra prevailing over the underworld. So you literally have a cycle of order and chaos throughout 24 hours in Egyptian mythology. It's a very consistent idea that chaos is an eternal cycle, and it cannot be defeated, but it can certainly be dealt with. And there you have the coexistence of order and chaos, which roughly states in these myths, and especially in this Tibetan myth, an accurate depiction of the world is the balance of order and chaos, good and evil, light and dark. So, of course, then we're forced to ask, well, that's all very interesting, but where does the Yeti fit into this? Well, the Yeti fits in where we actually see that in one translation of the ogress's name, which is Midi Drambai Rishi, sorry if I have pronounced that incorrectly, which roughly means man-bear or human-like beast. We have the word Yadi, which is actually where the Western term Yeti comes from, and it means the exact same thing. It means man-bear or human-like beast. And there are many names for this idea throughout the surrounding nations. You've got Mete, Zute, Yadi, Midi, Chuti, Telma Odrema, Migoi, Yeren, and of course Yeti. And those are only a few examples of the names that exist for different branches of the ogress, which is quite interesting. Not just the ogress, but also similar creatures to the ogress. So we're being introduced to a new archetype here. And we can tell that because this archetype is also present throughout other cultures. You have things like the European woodwolves and Enkidu from Sumerian mythology. And what they are is half animal, half human, roughly speaking. And their archetype filled out is often called the wild man. Their archetype often involves, like it is in the Tibetan myth, the coexistence with the more orderly and civilized people, or like the monkey in the Tibetan myth. Particularly in Sumerian mythology, Enkidu actually becomes the partner of the hero Gilgamesh, and they go on many adventures together. So there's coexistence with the wild right there. And even in North American tribal groups, you have Zonaqua is one of the West Coast names for the wild woman of the woods who fills in the wild man archetype. It should be noted that there are different branches of this wild man archetype in this particular mythology, the Tibetan mythology, that branches off into different iterations, and they even evolve those iterations. So you have one that is a bit less wild man, like the Miti, which is very animal-like and colorful. We actually have a picture here labeled Snowman Portrait, showing Yeti as natives think it looks, was drawn by Sherpa Kunjo Tumbi. So you have native depictions of these more animal-like wild man archetypes. In fact, the Westerners took this to be the Yeti, and culturally speaking, this may or not exactly be a Yeti, but it's certainly something quite similar. But you actually also see an evolution of these certain things. So the Miti here is this four-legged animal with this conical head, these very sharp teeth and these big ears, and this particularly slanted face. And what's interesting is this other picture here is also the Miti. And you can see that it's adopted a new skin pattern. It's more tiger-like in appearance, it's more human-like, but it's retained a few of its qualities, like the teeth, the eyes, the snout, and the conical head. So the archetype is changing the representation of the image that it embodies throughout time, but it is roughly conveying the same idea. And then you get to images like this, and this one is quite interesting because this is actually a Mongolian image. which is roughly, it's a bit away from Tibet. And it's a very interesting image. And people who mention it in cryptozoology often cite that it could be evidence that Yetis ate people. Now, the image is more complex than this. So let's go over the context behind this image that we know of. So this is an image referred to as symbolic offerings. It's from Mongolia, the 19th century. It is pigment on cloth. Rather unusual detail of this painting is the depiction of a Yeti couple tearing apart a human in the bottom right corner. So expanding that information, we have the imagery is supposed to be, quote unquote, a depiction of the universe showing Mount Meru, which is this sort of ancient, mythical, heavenly mountain in this mythology. You can actually see a depiction of it right here, where it's this sort of multifaceted, multi-level rising up into the heavens. Again, the idea of the heaven is the divine area of the world sort of thing. And things change as you get up there. So there's different ideas that you come across as you get closer to the ideal, maybe is what that says. Some people think that there's a particular mountain range, which is the Pamirs mountain range, which some scholars believe to be the basis for Mount Meru. And we don't know that, but look at it, no wonder. It's definitely a very multifaceted, rising into the heavens in the clouds mountain range. But let's get back to the image. So the image is a depiction of the universe, and you'll actually see that's probably the case, because you've got different elements in play here. So you've got the Yeti couple, the Yeti couple we'll call them, tearing apart the human. And you've got some significant aspects being played out here. Not just tearing apart the human. For one thing, there's extra human body parts. So this is not the first human that's being torn up. This is one in a series. You've also got the fact that there is, strangely enough, there is a distinction between the male and female figures in this image. So you've got the female figures, which might be the two Yeti, might be. And then you've got things like the two camels and the horse, which clearly have phallic illustrations attached to them. And some animals, like the dogs, tend not to, actually. So that could be a sex, an identification of the sex of these animals. So there's a mixture of male and female components here. What's very interesting is you've got what appear to be a human skull and a human pelvic bone up near one of the camels. So, and there's the earth in the background. So there is definitely this idea that there's something being torn apart and strewn across the landscape. Is that an idea of the creation myth, where something is torn to shreds and upon its dead body, new order comes out? Maybe. It's hard to say. So you've got this similar image here, and this image is more similar than you think. And this image is from Tibet, and this dates to around the same time, late 19th century. And what's fascinating is, as you start to examine the components, you realize that even though this is a cropped version, unfortunately I could not find the full image, and I apologize for that. This is essentially the exact same scene being depicted. So you've got these animals running around, there's a ton of animals running around, and you've got these two humanoid, long black hair on the head, almost like a mane, individuals, who are one of which is very large-breasted, and the one with large breasts is on the left, and the one that's eating a person is on the right. And we'll get to that in a moment. There's also these Buddhist symbols at the bottom here. And these Buddhist symbols are actually quite interesting. So from going from left to right with these symbols, you've got the bejeweled urn or vase, which is a symbol of immaterial wealth of knowledge. You've got the lotus flower, which is, again, this very interesting, the world is emergent idea. It's the emergence of the self from the darkness of the ground and from the darkness of ignorance, you could say, to the light of knowledge. So something that comes out of the darkness, much like the world. And then there's the conch shell, which you could even call the wake-up call. It's literally the audio call to enlightenment. So you've got the call to action, the call to change your reaction there. And then you have the eternal knot, which is a symbol of intertwinement. Even opposite feelings like anger and love are connected to each other eternally, which is all very interesting. And can certainly all of that be applied to the the value of the world in the view of this culture, you could say. And again, the fact that it's the theme of the world is quite interesting, especially in terms of the fact that this is a very similar image. Now, there is a distinction to be made between the two Yeti-like figures. So the one on the left that seems to be almost fleeing the scene is obviously very monstrous looking. But it's got this relatively human-like face, and then you have the one that's not fleeing and is eating a person. It's significantly less human-like. It's got this almost bear-like face, these more pronounced canines and teeth. It has a more protruding head even. It's got a muzzle on it. And its eyes are less expressive, so it's overall far more animalistic. It has a larger ear. It's far more animalistic than the one on the left. What's interesting is that between the creation image I showed in the beginning, between that and the Yeti image and the Mongolian image and this image, we find that many of these individuals are very large-breasted, and they tend to be the more peaceful ones. So for instance, in this image, the one that's fleeing and not eating the person has these very large breasts, and the one in the previous image, the Mongolian image, that is partaking less, let's say, in the tearing of this human, or is enjoying it less, and who's not focused on it, which is the case in the image, also has large breasts. And even the Yeti is portrayed with breasts, and strangely enough, so is the grandfather monkey, who is certainly a male figure. So there's the idea that the breasts here are intertwined with the idea of a lack of savagery, let's say. Now, I'd like to posit that these are the exact same image. And there are differences here. So like one of the significant differences here is that it seems that perhaps the Tibetan image actually had practical purpose because there are tally marks on the picture. This could have been used, since it is a depiction of the universe, as a time-keeping idol of some kind. These might be time marks. That is simply a hypothesis. There is nothing that would state that is certainly the case, but it's certainly quite interesting. And the Tibetan image and the Mongolian image bear many similarities. And again, even in the Mongolian image as well as the Tibetan image, the one that's partaking more in the slaying of the human is the one that looks more animalistic compared to its counterpart. It's got this rounder nose, these more bulgy cheeks, and these sharper teeth. And what's interesting is Tibet and Mongolia are roughly 2,000 miles away from each other. So they're quite a distance, and they had no contact that we know of before the Mongol invasion of Tibet, which happens in 1240. Again, no evidence of contact before that happens. So cultural sharing has clearly taken place since the year 1240 between Mongolia and Tibet, to the point where depictions of the universe are quite similar. And you have another similar image here, that there's a piece of Buddhist art from Mongolia, so now it's even spreading into other religions. And this is 18th century, so this is actually before those two images were created, and you have all these animals huddled around this central idea. You have this sort of temple in the middle, so it's this divine force that everything needs to adhere to. But who do you see off to the right here? But two long-haired, black-haired individuals, one of which who has larger breasts than the other one, who are also interacting with this sort of divine force in the middle. So this image is actually quite specific and seems to span a few centuries. And then you have a bit more of the wild man of the Tibetan mythology, archaeology here. Unfortunately, this is a rather unconfirmable find, but I thought it was interesting enough to share. It does come from a book written by Ivan Sanderson, who tended, I should say, may he rest in peace, to be you could almost call it a fanatic of sorts. But on the cover of his book, Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life, there is an illustration of what is apparently a Mongolian mask carved out of wood that seems to depict a very human ape-like face, which is interesting because it has very great ape-like features that Mongolians wouldn't have necessarily known about. And Ivan Sanderson here even creates a recreation of what the animal would have looked like, because the mask tends to be very skeletal in appearance. Is it an example of wild man archaeology? It probably is. Is it necessarily literal? There's just not enough to say. And then you have, more back in Tibet. This is a depiction found in the Drepung Monastery, which is another wild man archetype, but definitely shows more of the ogress side coming out. very wide hips, pendulous breasts, long hair, and she's definitely the ogress because she has these multi-arms and multi-legs. She's a monster of some kind. And she is ripping apart a human. She has a head in her hand. So there's this association with the thing that might be the ogress, because again, if you remember, the contemporary image showed the ogress eating things. So it might be that we're seeing the depiction of the monkey and the ogress in its sort of different iteration here. And the ogress is still the one who tends to be more aggressive. So throughout all that time, we then come to a very interesting find, which is referred to often as the medicine book Yeti. There are two variations of this image, and they are found in different versions of a book entitled The Anatomical Dictionary for Recognizing Various Diseases. It's a Tibetan medicine book that has been translated into Chinese, Mongolian, English, and those versions. So it refers to a specific creature that it calls the Migoi, which in certain translations means bear. But there's more to it than that. In fact, in the Tibetan translation, the passage says that the Migoi is a species of bear which lives high in the mountains and resembles man. And it's claimed there that the gallbladder of the Migoi is going to have healthy benefits if consumed. Different translations of Migoi, however, spread out from just man-like bear to bear man, general beast, and even in Mongolia, wild man. And here are the two images right here. One is just a bit more rough than the other, is one of the only essential differences. So, looking at the image, it's hard to deny that it doesn't quite look like a bear. It really doesn't. And what's strange about that is that Tibetan and Mongolian artwork tends to have attention to detail, even to the point where in this particular piece of Mongolian art, there are differentiations between the types of hooves that certain mammals have. The horse is different from the goat and the camel, and likewise the camel and goat. So that brings us, though, to a kind of wider scope if we're going to examine the rest of the art to kind of compare it to the images in the medicine book. There's an appalling lack of bears in Tibetan art, an appalling lack. In fact, there seem to be almost no depictions. There is one depiction that unfortunately I could not locate any information on, but it is certainly a Tibetan depiction of what looks to be a bear-like animal grabbing the tail of a hog, so maybe it's out hunting. And it has these long black fingers that might be claws. It's got these very pointed top of the head ears. It's very bulky, and it's got these hind quarters that don't look like they're supposed to be bipedal. So that could be a bear. It could be. And here's a Himalayan brown bear right here, if you want to kind of get an idea for it. Even the sort of frilly neck is portrayed as well. The issue being, it's also bearing some solid resemblances to our medicine book Yeti. So that would seem to add up at that point. Maybe this is how they draw bears. Of course, there's a few problems with that. And one of the problems being that if Sherpas are the ones drawing these, if Sherpas are the ones drawing these images, which they tended to be in many cases, you'd have to wonder why they would draw the bear as a wild man. Certainly they're not seeing the bear upright every time they see it. And, even linguistically, considering that there's different versions of Migoi that mean everything from bear to wild person, rough translations tend to cause difficulty in being able to tell if we're looking at a depiction of a wild man or of a bear. That does not erase the problem of the fact that there is very few bears, almost none perhaps. There are very few physically accurate bears in Tibetan artwork, even though the rest of the artwork tends to be very attentive. So we're stuck then with the issue of, well, either this is a wild man and there's just no bear art, or the bear has been severely misrepresented in the artwork, and there is not as much wild man artwork as we originally thought, which could be the case. And either way, it is a cultural anomaly, which is quite interesting. So what's interesting about this, though, is that this begins to move us into contemporary Yeti archaeology.